name, Lord. We bless your name. For God, you continue to bless us. And now, God, let your spirit fill the sanctuary. Usher in, oh God, the power of your presence. Remind us, God, how you have kept your promise. And even as your word is proclaimed, allow God the praise for you to go forth. Now, God, let the words of my mouth and meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. You, God, are strength, redeemer, and friend. And as your word goes forth, God, save those who are sinners and give strength, God, to the saints. We might celebrate, God, that you are still in the saving and sanctifying business in this world without end. And all the people of God did say amen and amen. I know I wasn't here with you all on last Sunday, but I hope that you remember where we are. I told you about a month ago that I was going to start in Acts chapter 2 and then leave it for about 2 weeks, and when I came back, I was going to be in Acts chapter 2 once again. This is the Sunday of my being back, so let's go once again to Acts chapter 2. Very familiar story and passage of scripture during the season of Pentecost. But as we continue in this series of messages, I am accepted. There's something in the text that calls our attention again on today, and I pray that it causes us to see ourselves anew. Amen. In the eyes of God. Acts chapter 2, beginning this time at verse number 14, we find these words. But Peter, standing up with the 11, raised his voice and said to them, Men of Judea, and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and heed my words, for these men are not drunk as you suppose, since it's only the third hour of the day. But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel, that it shall come to pass, that in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days. On your maidservant and your manservant. And in those days I will pour out my spirit. Again, this is the fourth installment in this series of messages. I am accepted. I want to tag this text and share from this subject. I am not rejected. Amen. I am not rejected. I am accepted. I am not rejected. Somebody ought to be celebrating just from the subject alone. I am not rejected. Nobody, and I do mean nobody, likes to be rejected. Whether it is applying for a job or asking a girl out on a date, nobody likes to be rejected. Whether it's applying for admission into a selective school or campaigning for a political office, nobody likes to be rejected. Nobody likes being the last person to be picked for a team or not being picked at all. Nobody likes being told no when we really thought we were going to get a yes. Nobody likes to be rejected. Rejection makes us feel unvalued or devalued. Rejection makes us feel unloved or unappreciated. In part, rejection makes us question our perception of ourselves and our reality. Rejection makes us question whether or not we are as smart as we think we are, or as cute or as handsome as we think we are, or as qualified or as capable as we think we are. Or rejection makes us question whether the people who we call friends are really our friends. Rejection makes us question whether the people who said that they would always be honest with us are really lying to us, because they told us that we were good enough, but then we got rejected. They told me that I was smart enough, but then I got rejected. They told me that all I had to do was to name it and claim it, but then I got rejected. The preacher told me that God told him to tell me that this was my season, but then I got rejected. Rejection makes us question our reality and our relationships, because nobody likes being rejected. But while nobody likes being rejected, rejection is built into the structures of our society, that everybody cannot win, everybody cannot have it all, everybody cannot get ahead. So while nobody likes to be rejected, all of us know what it feels like to be rejected. Am I in the right place? We all have a personal relationship with rejection. We know what it means to be rejected because we're black, or rejected because we are female. We know what it means to be rejected because of where we lived or where we were raised. We know what it means to be rejected because our credit score was too low, or our debt to income ratio was too high. We know what it means to be rejected because we were considered being too fat or too skinny, too tall or too short. We know what it means to be rejected for loans because we did not make enough money, or to be rejected for assistance because they said we make too much money. We know what it means to be rejected because we are underqualified or overqualified. But the Pentecost season is a reminder that those of us who have been socially rejected have been spiritually accepted. That those who have been rejected even by governments have been accepted by God. That those who have been rejected by others and have been oppressed by others have been accepted by the one true living God. And I'm not making that up on today. I'm talking to you from the text, because in the text on the day of Pentecost, where followers of Jesus were congregating in an upper room, and they heard the sound from heaven, and tongues of fire appeared to them and sat on each of them, and they began to speak the various languages of the earth, even though they had not studied them. On the day of Pentecost, when the men who and others who heard the sound came to the upper room and saw what was happening and heard what was happening on the day of Pentecost, when somebody asked, "What does this mean?" and some others accused the followers of Jesus of being drunk, and others laughed at them and mocked them, the text says that Peter stood up with the other 11 and he raised his voice. I like that today, because when you disrespect me, I raise my voice too. I like that today, because when you talk bad about me or my people, I raise my voice too. Sometimes, beloved, you got to raise your voice to get people's attention. Sometimes you got to raise your voice so people will know that you are not playing with them. Sometimes you got to raise your voice in order to be heard. Peter raised his voice, and he did not speak in an unknown tongue. He started speaking in a language where the folk who were hating on him could hear and understand. Listen, my friends, I'm not telling you to be reckless with your language, but I am telling you that sometimes you got to speak in a way that your audience can understand. And what did Peter say when he raised his voice? Peter said, "Men of Judea and all of those who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, that these men are not drunk as you say they are. It's only the third hour of the day. But this is what was spoken by God through the prophet, who said, in the last days I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your young sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your young men and girls will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams, and whoever will call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And while we often give attention to whom Peter is talking in the text, we often overlook who Peter is talking about. Peter is talking to men who came and made fun of the followers of Jesus, but Peter is talking about those who received some good news from Jesus. Peter is talking to the religiously regarded, but he's talking about some people who've been religiously disrespected. He is talking about the sons and the daughters, the young and the old, the males and the females who have been subjugated to lives of servitude. Peter is talking about those in whom it is said that children are to be seen and never to be heard. Peter is talking about those who serve the table but have not been given a seat at the table. Peter is talking about the ones who are advancing in age but slowing in ability. You know, the ones whom Trump and the Republicans said were a drain on the economy. Peter is talking about those who have been socially rejected, religiously rejected, economically exploited and rejected. And Peter says about the rejected that in God's name you have been accepted. He says to the connected about the rejected that this is what God spoke to us through the prophet Joel, that in the last days I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, not just on the flesh that you think is worthy of it, but in the last days I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your young men will dream dreams and your old men will prophesy. He says, I will pour out my flesh on all of the sons that your arrogance says is weak, on all of the daughters whom your misogyny says are dumb, on the very people that you have rejected. They are the ones I will use to prophesy. Your young men whom you have written off as nothing more than good for labor, God says I'll give them visions. Your old men who you think are too old to do anything, God says I will give them dreams. And the one who carries the title servant, God says I will fill them with my spirit. And we can learn some things about human rejection and God's acceptance from Peter's proclamation in today's pericope. I've been shouting in the microphone for the last 2 weeks at the general conference, but with the little bit of voice I got left, I want to tell you about rejection. And the first thing the text is teaching us today about rejection, watch it, is rejection is not a new thing, it's an old thing that keeps showing up in new ways. I know you felt rejected before. I know all of us have felt rejected before, but rejection is not a new thing. It's an old thing that keeps showing up in new ways. Because watch it, Peter does not create the words that he speaks in the first century setting of the text. He simply goes back and quotes words from a man named Joel, a prophet who lived anywhere from 800 to 300 years before Jesus. In other words, rejection was not something that started in the days after Jesus, but rejection was around even before Jesus. That's why years ago, when we millennials and baby boomers would feel rejected, when people would say bad things about about us, we would go home and tell mama or big mama, mama, they talking about me. And mama would say, baby, they talked about Jesus. In other words, baby, they didn't start talking about people when they started talking about you. But they've been talking about people for so long that they used to even talk about Jesus. Listen, my friends, you are not the first person to be rejected. You are not the first person to be talked about. You are not the first person to be disappointed, disrespected, and dismissed. Rejection is not a new thing. It's an old thing that keeps showing up in new ways. Listen, I know this is the 4th of July holiday weekend, but descendants of dark-skinned Africans in America are not just being rejected today, but they were also being rejected on that day in 1776. Africans enslaved in America did not have access to the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that's talked about in that Declaration of Independence. And 11 years later, the rights, the resources, and the protections promised to all American citizens in the Constitution were not extended to African slaves when that document was ratified in 1787, because African slaves were not considered citizens according to the Constitution. And not only were we not citizens, we also were not people. That's why the Constitution defines us as 3/5 of a person. And people like to say that it's all over. People like to say that we need to get past it. But I'm here to tell you that it's not over. It just shows up in new ways. Look at the old Jim Crow and look at the new Jim Crow. Look at the old lynching system and look at the new lynching system. Look at the cradle to prison pipeline. Look at the way state legislators and the Supreme Court are taking away voting rights and women's rights. Look at the way that black men and women, black boys and girls are still being lynched by people employed by law enforcement. I don't care how many celebrations you have. I don't care how much choreographed fireworks shows have lighting up the sky. I don't care how many firecrackers you pop all over the place. How many parades march down the street. How many barbecue grills are blazing in backyards. The speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1852 is still as relevant in 2022. For while the words may say that we are free on paper, we are not fully free in practice. While the words may say we have rights on paper, those rights are not constantly enforced in practice. They're ignoring the rights, stripping away the rights, and this is not new. Racism is not a new problem. Elitism is not a new problem. Misogyny is not a new problem. Sexism is not a new problem. Zealous patriotism is not a new problem. Prejudice and inequality is not a new problem. All of these are manifestations of rejection. And rejection is not something new. It's an old thing that shows up in new ways. Peter's proclamation in the pericope then teaches us in the first instance that rejection is not a new thing, it's an old thing that shows up in new ways. But then the second thing that Peter teaches us in his proclamation, watch it, is that rejection says less about you and more about who or what is rejecting you. Rejection says less about you and more about who or what it is that is rejecting you. Because earlier I said that we all know what it means to be rejected. Rejected because we're black or female or where we were born, where we come from. We all know what it's like to be rejected for those things. But we also know what it's like to be rejected when the rejection has nothing to do with us. That's why years ago we would go tell Big Mama they talking about me. She didn't just say, baby, they talked about Jesus. The whole thing she said was, baby, they talked about Jesus and he was perfect. That's what she said, baby. They talked about Jesus and he was perfect. In other words, when it came to Jesus, people found fault where there was no fault. When it came to Jesus, people found blame where there was no blame. That people found wrong where there was no wrong. In other words, they talked about Jesus not because something was wrong with Jesus, but they talked about Jesus because something was wrong with them. I like that. Just because people are talking about you or rejecting you, it may not necessarily mean that something is wrong with you. Something may just very well be wrong with them. Listen, oftentimes rejection says nothing about you, but it says everything about the system or the somebody that is judging you. There is nothing wrong with your skin. The real problem is that there is a system that judges you according to your skin. There is nothing wrong with your outspokenness. The real problem is that there is a system in somebody's that expect you to keep silent in the midst of your suffering. There is nothing wrong with where you came from or where you live right now. The problem is there's a system that elevates other areas, neighborhoods, and schools over yours. There is nothing wrong with the clothes that you wear. As long as you got clothes on your body, you ought to thank God for it. The real problem is that there is a system that values labels and name brands over loving the least, the lonely, the lost, and the left out. There is nothing wrong with your church. The problem is that there is a system that we think bigger means better, and if it's smaller, somebody thinks something is wrong. But there is nothing wrong with you or what is connected to you. The real problem is the system and the somebodies who are judging you. And this is why, my friends, rejection may be painful, but you cannot take rejection too personally, because rejection says less about you and more about the somebody or the system that is judging you. The rejection of you says something about their values. The rejection of you says something about their biases. The rejection of you says something about their prejudices. The rejection of you says something about the way they've been raised and where they have been brought up. So I know it's painful, but don't take the rejection of you too personally, because it's not your fault that some people are so blind that they can't see a blessing even when it's standing right in front of them. Don't take it too personally, because it's not your fault that some people are so deaf that they can't hear the words of the divine being spoken from your lips. Don't you take it too personally, because it's not your fault that some people are so tacky and so tasteless that they talk bad to you and about you because they have not tasted to see that you are a real treat. Don't take it personally, because it's not your fault that some people's noses are so far stuck up somebody else's behind that they cannot smell the sweetness of your fragrance that you bring into every circumstance or situation that you walk into. It is not your fault that some people are so traumatized and touched with trouble that they cannot handle you like the treasure that you are. It is their eyes that are broken. It is their ears that are broken. It is their system that is broken. It is their house that is broken. It is their parents who are broken. It's their system that is broken. It's their melanin making machine that malfunction. It is their system, their eyes, their ears, their heart. You are all right. broken. Rejection says less about you and more about the somebodies and the systems that are judging you. But then I gotta quit right here. Third and finally, Peter in his proclamation tells us in the text that rejection has limits. Watch it. But God's acceptance is unlimited. I like that Peter is preaching in this pericope, y'all, and Peter tells us that rejection has limits, but God's acceptance is unlimited. For those whom Peter references in the text are those who have been historically rejected. But Peter announces that they are being unlimitedly accepted. Even with the blotches and the blemishes that society has used to burden them, Peter says they are being accepted. Even with the stripes and the stains that society has used to segregate them, Peter announces in the text that they are the ones who are being accepted. Even though they have been judged by the way they look or how they carry themselves on the outside, Peter announces that they have been accepted by God because of something that's on the inside. Because I'm sure that somebody would raise the question, how is it that they are accepted? They don't have means nor money. They don't have titles nor treasures. They don't have high status or records of success. How in the world are these the folk who are being accepted? Well, let me stop right there and tell somebody, beloved, that the signs of your success and the signs of your acceptance, it cannot be money. Because money is man-made and distributed. The system of economics that informs money needs to have a group of haves and have-nots. So be leery of people who tell you that without money you cannot be accepted by God. The sign of your acceptance, it cannot be social status. Because social status requires that some be at the top while others remain at the bottom. And the masses are stuck in the middle. Don't let anybody tell you that you need a certain status, especially a high status, to be accepted by God. The sign of your acceptance, it cannot be the color of your skin. Because none of us have control over the melanin in our skin. We may bleach it or tattoo it, but from our mother's womb we cannot control it. The sign of our acceptance cannot be skin because it's been racialized, where some are elevated and others are regulated. So be leery of people who want to tell you that with or without the right color skin, you cannot be accepted by God. The sign of your acceptance, it cannot even be speaking in tongues, because there are those who are born with birth defects who don't even have the ability to vocalize in a native tongue. They can't even speak the language that their mama and daddy spoke all the days of their lives. But while these markers of rejection are limited, God signals God's acceptance of us with something that is unlimited. So I heard Peter say that Joel said that God said that in the last days I will pour out my spirit, the spirit that moved over the face of the deep and was there at the creation of the earth. In the last days I will pour out my spirit, the spirit that was breathed into the dust of man and made man a living being. God says in the last days I will pour out my spirit, the spirit spirit that blew from the east across the waters of the Red Sea and divided the water so that Israel could walk through on dry ground. God says in the last days, I will pour out my spirit. The spirit that began to move, it blew on the fleece, and the fleece was dried one day, blew again the next day, and the ground was wet and the fleece was dry. In the story of Gideon, God says, I'll pour out my spirit, not just on somebody, but I'll pour it out on everybody. I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. That's what God has said about us. Well, I gotta go to my sheet, but when I began to think about the text again, I remember thinking about the days of old when you used to go by and buy clothes or go buy housewares from the store. When you got the clothes home, you could look on the inside and there would be an inspection sticker. The inspection sticker would say this garment was inspected by number 0345. When you went and got some housewares, you could open the lid and it would tell you who inspected it. The purpose of the inspection was to let you know that before it got to you, it passed an inspection that says it met specifications. It passed an inspection that says it met qualifications. It passed an inspection that says it met expectation. And I began to think today about Satan, the fallen angel, and in my sanctified imagination, I could see Satan hard at work in the sorting department of humanity. And as humanity began to come down the conveyor belt, he picked out the ones with black skin and he threw them into a barrel of rejection. He picked out the ones with bad credit and he threw them into a barrel of rejection. He picked out the ones who were disabled and he threw them into a barrel of rejection. He picked up the ones who were female. He picked up the ones who were poor. He picked up the ones who were young. He picked up the ones who were old. And he threw all of them into a barrel of rejection. But then one day, a new employee showed up in the sorting department. And he didn't sit where Satan was. He went over to the barrel of rejection. And everybody that was in the barrel, he began to pick them up and put them on the belt so they could go further. Satan asked him, why are you picking them up? They've already been rejected. He didn't know that he was talking to the Spirit. And the Spirit said that you may call them rejected, but God has given me a mandate that they are accepted, because the very people that you are trying to leave out are the very ones that God wants to let in. So rejected people, you ought to rejoice that as black as you are, as poor as you are, as fat as you are, as blind as you are, as weak as you are, as ostracized as you are, rejected folk rejoice that God has picked you up, turned you around, placed your feet on higher ground. Rejected people rejoice because you have been accepted by the Spirit of God. God says, in the last days, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. All means And it says to us, we better be careful about how we treat people. I tell folk all the time, be careful how you treat me. God is particular, choicey when it comes to me. Be careful what you say about me. If I don't hear it, God hears it. And God's ears perk up when you start talking about me. Be careful how you treat me. Because God is particular about me. And when you try to oppress me and hold me down, you got a God to answer to. All of us who've been rejected can rejoice. Because in God we've been accepted. And because we've been accepted, watch this, we've got to be careful how we treat other people. Be careful what you say about folks, because they may not live your standard. None of us live God's standard. Be careful how you treat people, because they may have outward sin. All of us have inward sin. Be careful how you treat people, because you think they sleeping with somebody they shouldn't be sleeping with. All of us got a record. Somebody that record, you done slept with some folk you shouldn't have been sleeping with either. Be careful how you talk about folk, because what they put in their mouths. All of us to put something in our mouths. Maybe it wasn't weed, maybe it wasn't liquor. But if you can look at most of us, you know it's food. Because sometimes the very ones you are trying to oppress and ostracize and reject are the very ones God is talking about when he says, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. And sometimes our rejection of them, listen, is a rejection of God. That's what we told white folks. We knew God in Africa before white folks showed up. So when Africans were brought as slaves in America, when we got our hands on scripture, we knew that what they were trying to tell us and teach us and do to us was wrong. And we said to white folks trying to enslave us and reject us, you are rejecting the very God that you claim to love and to serve. And when we sit up and reject and oppress and ostracize others, we are doing the same thing to them that we accuse white races of doing to us. But Peter reminds us that God says in the last days, I'm going to pour out my spirit on all flesh. All flesh means that God is in this thing with all of us. High or low, rich or poor. Songwriter said, this one thing I do know, Christ is the answer for you. And today, my friends, whoever you are and wherever you are, the invitation to God's acceptance is extended to you. You may be here in the house, you may be out there with us in virtual church, but today there's an invitation being extended to include your name in the all. The all who call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. The all flesh who will receive God's Spirit, include your name in the all. As we stand to our feet and the doors of the church are open, the invitation is extended. Then maybe you're out there today and you just need to say yes and give your life to God through Jesus Christ. I know it's Independence Day weekend, Today, God says you are accepted and you can reconnect. Maybe God has been speaking to your heart, calling you to higher service, higher ministry. Maybe you've been running from it. Today, God says, run no more. You are accepted. The season of rejection is over, and the season of acceptance is right